Hello and welcome to Carbon Clarity, the podcast for the carbon curious. My name is Kev Kulik. I'm your host. I'm the MD and founder of Hut22 Limited. And today I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by none other than Tom Wigg, Senior Advisor for Net Zero Carbon Buildings at the UK GBC. Hey Tom, how you doing?
Yeah, delighted to be here. Thanks very much, Kev. Doing well, thank you.
Good. I'm very glad to hear it. We'll declare an interest. Quite a few of my guests on the podcast have been people I used to work with, and we used to work together, of course, a few years ago. So it's great to see you again. But I tell you what, if you could give us 5 minutes on how you got to where you are, how you got to become a senior advisor at the UK GBC, your interest in sustainability, your background, and so on.
Yeah, sure thing. I grew up sort of being exposed to the construction industry because my dad was involved in it from when I was very young, and I actually when I was doing my GCSEs thought I wanted to go on to become an architect. I always loved design, but also loved sciences and maths, and I thought I'd probably best to keep my options open. So I studied just sciences and maths at A level, and I had that moment of having a teacher that really sort of changes the trajectory of your life. And had a physics teacher called Mr. Brinded who made me fall in love with physics. And it was for that reason that I decided to pursue physics at university and moved to Bristol to study a master's in physics with astrophysics. Absolutely loved it. Gave me everything that I wanted out of my kind of university career. But I think I realized about halfway through my fourth year that I definitely wasn't cut out for a career in research physics. You have to have a very, very special mind to be able to make any sort of impact in physics. So absolutely loved finishing up my master's, but then needed to take a step back and figure out what I wanted to do. So took a few months off and realized sustainability has always been really important to me. Remembered that the construction industry and the built environment was always of interest, and was very fortunate to be offered a graduate sustainability role at Hawley, which is where we met. And I was there for about 5 or 6 years. Yeah. You want to come in there? Sorry.
No, not at all. No, carry on. I was going to say something actually. I just love the fact that you name check your teacher. That's brilliant. I had exactly the same experience, but I didn't go to university until I was a mature student, and that's what made me change from my career as an engineer to a sustainability consultant, Dr. Tony Day at South Bank University. Sorry, please carry on. I didn't mean to indicate that I want to come in.
Not at all. Yeah, I know it's interesting, isn't it, how you can really sort of track back those individuals or those moments that really change the trajectory of your life. And I ended up meeting my now wife at university, and most of the people who I call my best friends. So if it weren't for Mr. Brinded, I'm not sure I'd be where I am now. But yeah, after I joined Hawley, I had a fantastic, I think, 5 or 6 years really getting to grips with what sustainability meant in the sector. And I think it was also a very fortunate time to get involved in sustainability because there seemed to be a real paradigm shift around the kind of late 2010s. I think it was the IPCC 1.5 degrees report, local authorities declaring climate emergencies, the government ratifying their net zero target that really changed the dial and meant that we were no longer kind of the bad guys in every room, the thorn in everyone's side, the people that were just being asked to do the minimum we could to meet planning policy or corporate commitments, to all of a sudden seeing these kind of ring-fenced budgets for sustainability to be delivered on projects and no one knowing how to spend them. And all of a sudden we were able to really bring some insight that I think did change the approach on many projects. But it was through that Hawley, being advancing net zero partners on the Advancing Net Zero programme at UK Green Building Council, Gold Leaf members, that I was able to engage in a couple of projects from the Hawley side and realise the impact that UK Green Building Council's guidance and actions have in the sector. I think when an opportunity to come and sit on the other side of the table joining UK GBC came up, it was something I was really, really grateful to be offered, and have had a fantastic 3 years there.
That's fantastic. Yeah, that's great. It's quite an inspiring journey, isn't it? As you say, there are key moments in your career when you realise. I mean, for me, it's just kind of realising what was really important to me, and that's so often the case with people who work in this field, isn't it? Okay, you mentioned UK GBC, of course, which is where you're sitting right now. And one of the reasons that I wanted to speak to you was the recent release of the pilot version of the long-awaited Net Zero Carbon Building Standard, which is a real, I think, milestone for the industry. Not least because of the amount of collaboration that's come together. What often happens with standards is you have lots of standards trying to do a similar thing in slightly different ways, all aiming for the same goal, and that's great. But it does mean there's a lot of confusion for the market, and they don't quite know which standard to look at and whether to go for, I don't know, a LEED standard or a BREEAM standard or whatever it might be. But this brings a lot of thinking together, doesn't it?
It does, yeah. I'm still sort of pinching myself that we're finally here, because it's been 3 years since I joined UKGBC, and I was handed by my former colleague Emily Hune. She was just wrapping up a process of market analysis with lots of our members into whether there was an industry demand for a more robust means of verifying a building as net zero. We obviously had our framework definition for net zero buildings that was published in 2019. And I saw the impact that was having when I said I was sort of sitting on the other side of the table working as a sustainability consultant. And it really allowed ambitious clients and design teams to make it very easy to specify net zero on their projects and know that they're delivering net zero on their projects. And before that framework definition was published in 2019, there wasn't really any kind of sort of cohesive or definition through consensus of what net zero meant for a building in the UK. And so it's quite funny now to be sat here 5 years later and have seen the progress that's been made across the sector, and be at the end of what has ended up being an incredibly collaborative journey. So the market analysis that Emily was wrapping up, there was some very, very clear conclusions from that there was absolutely a need for a more robust means of verifying buildings as net zero in the UK, but also the industry didn't want another kind of black box certification scheme that's run for commercial gain. It wanted something that was developed by industry for industry. And I was handed those conclusions and worked with the other professional institutions, industry bodies that were involved in that market analysis, just discussing for about 6 months, figuring out how it is that we take those conclusions forwards in a way that responds to the needs of the industry. And yeah, it's from that the UK Net Zero Carbon Building Standard was born. And now 3 years later, we're sat here with the pilot version out. So
there it is.
Yeah, the level of collaboration is, I think, something we can be really proud of. We had sort of 9 of the key professional institutions and industry bodies in the UK built environment, supported by about 350 industry experts that all volunteered their time from across 5 task groups, 14 sector groups. We had a number of people involved in the stakeholder engagement. We had, I think, 500 odd responses to a public consultation. And now we sit here with the spoils.
You do, a babe in arms, as it were. I mean, I think that's great. I hadn't realised that Emily sort of started that sort of consultation process, actually. I think I worked with Emily on the original guidance around, was it energy? The energy procurement guidance that we did. The renewable energy procurement guidance, wasn't it? Yeah. Anyway, well, one of the questions I was going to ask you was, why do we need a standard? But I think you kind of alluded to it there a little bit, because there was, before the framework came out, UKGBC Net Zero Carbon Framework, there wasn't an easy way for clients who are conscientious and wanted to do more, to be able to specify that they wanted a net zero carbon building, because there was no clear definition of it. So is that the problem it was trying to solve, or was it trying to do other things too?
Yeah, so the framework definition filled a very clear gap in industry's needs, and it made it simple to specify and simple to benchmark whether your project was responding to this collective net zero definition. But then since 2019, there's been loads of fantastic work across the sector by lots of industry bodies, lots of private organizations, to flesh out what net zero means, how you deliver it. But I think with that sort of proliferation of interest and energy around it, also introduces ambiguity, and wherever there's ambiguity, you end up with the sort of propensity for greenwashing. So I think, one need that it was filling was trying to bring back together all of those fantastic efforts to better understand what net zero means and define a really clear, robust verification process, so becoming a bit of a single point of truth for that. I think the other big gap that it filled is we've gone on a journey over the last 5 or so years from where the framework definition said that it was enough to just do what you can on site, reduce emissions as far as possible, and then look to offset to achieve net zero. We now understand that there is a total carbon budget available left globally if we are to stand a chance of mitigating warming to that kind of critical 1.5 degree threshold, and that each nation is entitled to a portion of that carbon budget. Each individual sector is entitled to a portion of that carbon budget. And then you can boil it down to individual assets and individual people. Everybody has a fair share of that budget that they're entitled to. And so it's no longer enough to just sort of pay your way out by buying offsets and then calling your building net zero.
Yes, of course.
Each individual asset has its own responsibility to reduce its emissions in line with that overall national and global carbon budget. So a big part of the standard was about understanding what a budget looks like for the built environment, and then understanding what that means for each individual building in each sector, so that each building knows that it is compatible with a sector-wide sort of transition to net zero.
I thought that was a great part of the standard, actually. I really like that. I'll come on to why I like it in a minute. I think maybe what we ought to do, actually, as we're talking about the standard and all the people who collaborated on it, we haven't got time to name check all 350 experts, but should we just name check the institutions that were involved? I think that would be worthwhile doing it, wouldn't it? So, I mean, you've got UKGBC, of course. You've also got, I think I'm right in saying, CIBSE. You've got Letty, who were involved. The RIBA were involved. Who else was involved in that?
We've got the RICS, the Institution for Structural Engineers, Carbon Trust, BRE, and BBP. So I hope I've not forgotten anyone there, but I think that was the 9, including UKGBC, that were involved in that initial sort of collaboration that then evolved to become the technical steering group, which I sat in representing UK Green Building Council.
Yeah, and that kind of really lends such a weight to the standard, doesn't it? It's a great bit of work, it really is. And you also talked about the fact that actually the framework definition in 2019 filled a gap, and of course it absolutely did do that. But, and I see this a lot in carbon management particularly, it's about a process of continuous development. As you learn more, you need to be prepared to kind of reflect on what you've said before and update that guidance, or update your strategy, or update your approach. And that's what happened with the renewable energy procurement stuff that I worked on originally with Emily and all the other people who are involved in that. And the same with the framework, and the kind of standard builds on that, doesn't it? You also mentioned a robust verification process, implying that there must be some criteria that you need to hit or achieve in order to be able to get your project verified as net zero carbon against the standard. So what would be useful perhaps is a run through the criteria that it uses, because it isn't just, well, I'll let you explain it. You understand it far better than I do. So you go for it before I make a fool of myself again.
Well, I think, there's a combination of elements within the standard. So there is the approach to assessing energy and carbon, and then a supporting set of definitions. So it defines whether your building is new, existing, or a retrofit, different types of works. So do they trigger the threshold for being classed as a retrofit, or are they just works that need to be understood and reported? Definitions of different sectors and subsectors, because there are different limits that need to be met for each of those. And then things such as the reporting period. But I think the key thing is the metrics, limits and targets that the standard provides. So I mentioned about that the need to understand what a building's fair share of the sector's carbon budget looks like. But it isn't just about carbon. Buildings have a role to play in supporting our national decarbonisation in line with net zero. So carbon is a really important element, but buildings have a really important role to play in supporting the electricity system to decarbonise. Whilst we are going to leverage the electricity system decarbonising and transitioning to renewables to help decarbonise other sectors like transport, like buildings, by electrifying heat, that's not going to happen without the support of other sectors, and buildings need to reduce their demand and become much more flexible, as well as generating electricity on site, if we're going to be able to decarbonise the grid in line with our kind of current 2030 now target for it becoming net zero. So that's why we've introduced limits not just on upfront carbon, but also on things like energy use intensity, because there's going to be a finite quantity of renewable energy that's available in future in this zero carbon grid, and each building can't take more than its fair share of that available renewable energy. Similarly, we've got targets for on-site generation, because a significant proportion of the future zero carbon energy that we're going to have in the UK grid is going to need to come from PV panels on the building's roofs.
Yes, of course. And the limits that you've set, I guess if I think back to the work that I think it was the Dutch Green Building Council did originally, when they looked at the trajectory that buildings needed to take to to only consume their fair share or only produce their fair share of emissions, and they arrived at this kind of 60% reduction by whenever it was. I can't think when it was now exactly, but that was based on this idea, as you mentioned before, of a global budget of emissions, wasn't it? And then kind of disaggregating that down into, I guess, was it by country and then by sector and so on. So is that what you did? You did a top-down analysis of that to figure out what each sector's budget was?
Yeah, so I co-led the top-down task group alongside my colleague on the technical steering group, Jess Hrivnak from the RIBA. And it was our job to figure out what those sectoral budgets were. Alongside that, we also looked at trying to create a full stock model of the UK built environment, because we need to understand what does the stock across the entire UK look like, to understand where we are today and therefore where we need to get to.
Yeah, and there's more information out there on that than people might think, isn't there? The government actually produce quite a lot of data on the building stock around the UK, don't they?
They do, but it was actually surprising how disaggregated it was, and the progress that we made as a task group.
Too disaggregated, maybe.
Yeah, it was. It's sort of done by devolved nation. There was no centralized source of information for all of the countries within the UK, and then it was split by sector and subsector in some instances. So yes, some fantastic colleagues on that task group did a lot of work pulling together those disparate data sets into what we think is one of the best collated data sets of floor space per sector and subsector, and also median energy demand.
Yeah, that is interesting. I guess that's historic, isn't it? I guess that's looking back at what there is right now. And did you think about what demands? I mean, the thing that comes to my mind quite often when I'm thinking about requirements for space for different sectors and things, of course, is COVID, and the way that absolutely just changed our whole understanding about what we really need in terms of the amount of space that we build. And I wonder, in doing that aggregation, did you kind of consider that, I suppose, in that maybe we're in some ways overstocked in some sectors? If we are, I don't know if we are. I'm speculating.
No, it's a really good question. So part of it was understanding where we are today. That includes both what floor space look like, what our energy demands look like, but also understanding what our budgets are going to look like over the next 25 years. So our starting point for the embodied carbon budget was the UK Green Building Council's Whole Life Carbon Roadmap that was published in 2021. And that was developed to be broadly aligned with the CCC's sixth carbon budget. So it was through that we were ensuring that the embodied carbon budget that we were creating was linking back to that kind of global context.
That's good. I did think about that. Tom Spurrier, my colleague, your ex-colleague, just kind of led that work, didn't he? And I did wonder how much this all kind of tied together with that earlier work, and whether that was kind of still valid in light of the fact that everything moves on so quickly, but it's great that you kind of drew on that.
Yeah, well, this is it. We weren't looking to try and reinvent the wheel. It's about building on everything that exists, but then moving things forwards as understanding improves. And so, you mentioned about, is it sort of top down, the process that we took? And yes, it was. Our task group's efforts were about creating these budgets and this stock model. But actually, we also wanted to ensure that any sort of future pathways and limits and targets that we create aren't just aligned with what's necessary from the top down, but also rooted in what's possible from the bottom up as far as is feasible. And it's for that reason we did a big exercise of data collation, capturing embodied carbon and energy data from existing buildings, existing construction projects. We had 14 sector groups I mentioned earlier that had, I think, around about 150, 200 sector experts that were providing data, informing what current best practice, but also future best practice looks like in each of these sectors. And by combining that bottom-up information with the top-down budgets into a large tool that can model the building stock from today out to 2050, including projected growth in the floor space in different sectors, as you mentioned, as well as rates of retrofit, rates of fuel switching, depths of retrofit, and also sort of other external factors such as rates of grid decarbonisation, rates of material supply chain decarbonisation. And by pulling the levers that we think in the built environment we have some control over, such as retrofit rates and fuel switching, we work to pull the overall built environment emissions and energy sort of spend to within those top-down budgets that we'd created. And so using that overall coordinated model of the UK built environment to inform the limits and the targets we hope we've ended up with a suite of limits and targets that are not only aligned with what's necessary, but also do reflect what is feasible in future based on the insight from those sector experts I mentioned.
I mean, that is fantastically interesting. So I wonder then, the thought that comes to my mind is that having done that modelling and having pulled the various levers in different ways to set out those limits and the future limits, because it doesn't only set limits now, does it? The standard has limits running right the way through from now until when do the limits run out to?
2050.
They run all the way out to 2050. So it strikes me that presumably you would be able to describe what it was you anticipate each sector needs to do in order to, in the future, in any given year, you would expect their sector to look like this in order to meet those limits. So that would be an incredibly useful bit of guidance, a bit of foresight for sectors to have on hand.
Yeah, and I think this is what we haven't really publicised so much anymore. There are the suite of net zero carbon building standard limits that are available in the pilot version that have been published. They don't reflect what the average sector performance needs to be. They reflect, I think, kind of market leading performances in each sector. But behind those limits, I mentioned we have this fully coordinated model of the UK building stock, and that shows what proportion of which sector needs to achieve what level of performance and by when. So you can draw out what percentage of say the domestic stock needs to be retrofitted to what depth by 2030 if we're to stay aligned with this overall coordinated decarbonisation trajectory and pathway. And so we really hope that additional information behind the limits that are in the pilot version will give us a really strong advocacy piece to help inform local and national planning policy in the future.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. A really valuable kind of squeezing all the value you can out of all that research and effort, which is definitely worthwhile. One thing that when people think about net zero carbon, as soon as you talk about net zero carbon, you accept that it's a thing, then you also necessarily have to accept that in order to actually achieve net zero carbon as a status, with all the technology that we've got right now and what we know, because even when you reduce your emissions as far as possible, there still be something left. So to get that implies that you need to do something to reduce that to zero. And that would, of course, traditionally be offsetting and purchase of carbon credits to the tune of whatever emissions are left to get to net zero. But that's not part of the process that's set out in the standard, is it? And some people might think that's strange. But can you explain why that isn't part of the standard?
Yeah, it's a really good question. It was a hotly contested topic during the development.
I bet it was.
And yeah, our framework definition, the UK GBC framework definition, does require that the final step of any kind of net zero building strategy is to offset any residual emissions. I think it's worth taking a step back here and highlighting how the term net zero gets a bit conflated and misunderstood, because net zero, if you look globally, net zero means that we are removing as many emissions from the atmosphere as human-made actions are emitting by 2050. But that gets conflated with the journey to net zero emissions by 2050. And I think that decarbonisation in line with a scenario that allows us to a chance of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees, that doesn't just mean that we hit net zero by 2050. That means we rapidly and immediately reduce emissions from today. So there's the conflation of this kind of immediate reduction of emissions to net zero by 2050 that gets conflated with net zero emissions in future. But then when you start looking at something like an individual organisation or an individual building, people assume that net zero means then removing as many emissions from the atmosphere or offsetting as many emissions as your building is causing residually. And yeah, previously where we were talking about net zero for buildings, to have any sort of robustness in a claim, it was showing that you had accounted for those residual emissions and then procured sort of high quality offsets so that your building at the asset levels emissions were zero when you net them. But actually, if we reduce the emissions in line with this sort of overall stock model of the built environment that we've created, if every individual building does its part of reducing emissions in line with this decarbonisation scenario, then there wouldn't be the need for offsets for us to not take more than our fair share of the carbon budget. Now, it's highly unlikely that's going to happen, but the principle that you need offsets to get to net zero doesn't necessarily hold true when you look at individual sectors or individual organizations. Now, that's not to say that offsets aren't a really important tool, and I think there's been a lot of often unfair bad press around offsets in the last few years, but the priority must always be reducing your absolute emissions in line with these science-based or science-led limits.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with that, Tom, to be honest. I mean, that I really like that sentiment of the problem with net zero. I suppose one of the problems that's been associated with it, from in my mind anyway, is this idea, exactly as you said, of conflating the end with the journey. And that's exactly right. One way that we might seek to tackle that is by having a different instrument to describe the journey from where we are now to net zero carbon. And that could be ISO 14068 Part 1, which does exactly that. It talks about the fact that, perhaps in not so many words, but that net zero carbon is a term that's kind of being misused because it doesn't describe the journey, it describes the end. And 14068 talks about carbon neutrality, which is also another term which has been very badly abused by many, but it's about the process. It's about the transition from where we are now to net zero carbon. So I'd urge people to go and have a look at that. I'll put a link in the show notes for that. Yes. So where were we? Yes. So offsetting isn't right. And I really liked, when I read the standard, this notion that you are contributing to the national trajectory of taking the UK from where it is today to net zero carbon by its target date. And that's kind of exactly the principle that underpins it, isn't it?
Yeah, it is, and there's also the option of looking to procure high quality renewable energy as another way of kind of mitigating your residual emissions, and it's not an offset, but I think that was the sort of easiest categorization when you're trying to understand this distinction between the actions that you're doing at the asset level and then actions that you're taking to contribute to wider kind of cross-sectoral decarbonisation. And yeah, you mentioned the renewable energy procurement guidance that you were involved with earlier. I led the project to update that guidance.
Yeah.
Recently, and yeah, it's amazing the role and the impact that the way buildings engage in the energy markets can have in helping to accelerate the decarbonisation of the wider energy system. And yeah, it's for that reason that we've allowed, in the optional route to net zero carbon aligned building plus offset, we've allowed renewable energy procurement, which is done in line with the UK GDC guidance to enable you to mitigate your electricity emissions.
Yeah, brilliant. So the pilot version came out in September. I think I'm right in saying September, wasn't it?
It was indeed, yeah.
So it's been out for a little while now. Have you had any early feedback on the pilot version, and just kind of getting a sense of what people think about it? Any, feedback, things you think, oh, actually, yeah, we didn't think of that. I mean, you had a lot of people thinking about it, so I'm guessing there's not much of that. But how have you found the feedback so far?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that the level of engagement has been fantastic. There's no such thing as bad press, but just generally the amount that industry and wider have engaged in it has been fantastic. And I think that's credit to the effort that everybody involved in its development has put into collaborating and advocating for it. I'm also really pleased that generally the feedback has been overwhelmingly positive. There have been times where there has been feedback on maybe the magnitude of specific limits for specific sectors not being achievable or deliverable. But we based the limits on the data that we had available when we were developing the standard. And there were some sectors we had very robust and strong data sets for, others where we didn't have as much. And actually, if this pilot version is the catalyst for some sectors that maybe weren't as engaged with the standard previously, coming out and speaking up against the against the limits and providing us data that shows what's actually possible, then I consider that a success. The more engagement that we get, the higher the quality and the higher the quantum of data that we get, the better. And that's why I think this pilot process over the next 12 months is going to be so important, because we're not putting it out there as the silver bullet. We're saying, this is where we've got to. We need to understand how this is going to be used in industry and refine it to ensure that it is delivering as robust and as valuable a guidance for the industry.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that would be a great outcome, wouldn't it, to be able to gather more data, because without data, it's very hard to kind of decide what you need to do, really. Do you think then that some of the limits, well, I guess in 12 months' time, we'll probably be sure that something in the standard will change as you learn more through this pilot process, as you say. But is your gut feeling that some of the limits might change? Because I've heard what you say from people, that for some sectors very specifically, oh, that looks like it's tricky. That one number there looks like it's a difficult thing to achieve. Do you think some things will change?
I think the short answer is no with the limits. There's a huge amount of work that went
Okay.
into developing this initial suite of limits. And if you change the limits for one specific subsector, then all other sectors need to adjust and adapt, and the
Yeah.
entire modeling needs to be redone. But that's not to say that additional data and feedback from sectors isn't going to be really valuable. And the version 1 that we publish at the end of 2025, which will be the first version you can actually verify against, that's not going to be the end point. We're going to need to constantly update, evolve, and refine this. But industry's already been waiting 3 years. We knew we needed to get something out there. So it's going to be a case of now, hopefully, the drumbeat of engagement and refinement will continue over the next couple of decades.
Have you seen any indications that projects will be using the standard, even though it is only pilot version? Do you think there are indications that projects are going to say, well, actually, this is good enough for me. It's kind of really given us some great guidance. We're going to apply it and try and meet the standard, even though we can't verify it right now.
Well, yeah, I hope so. I think that, well, my hope is that in a couple of years' time, it will be a reputational risk to call your building net zero in the UK without being verified against this standard.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yes,
so
I agree.
We've got the framework definition at the moment that will be transitioning to the net zero building standard over the next sort of 12 months. But so I know that there are buildings that are still using the framework definition to inform their approach to design, construction, and operating net zero buildings. But there's going to come a point where the standard will be the de facto approach. And any efforts that are made in the next 12 months to understand what how your building is currently performing, and starting to track, collate the data that's necessary to demonstrate and verify in line with the net zero building standard is not going to be wasted time, because at the moment that the first version gets published, if you've got your 5 years of embodied carbon data, your 1 year of operational energy data collated, ready to go, you'll be in the best position to immediately verify rather than having to wait for another 12 months. So I don't think there's any risk in starting to understand and align with the net zero building standard today, even if we're still piloting it.
I think you're right. I mean, the point about reputational risk is really valid as well, isn't it? And the flip side, of course, is you can imagine that early adopters are going to see some opportunity in that space, aren't they? By verifying early, preparing for it, taking it on board, building it into their strategies and so on. We've talked quite a bit about the amount of effort that went into producing the standard and all the people that were involved. But are there things, despite it taking 3 years, that you couldn't include that because there wasn't time, or because there were things that you couldn't just work out, didn't have the data, or whatever it might be?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the first thing is, I mentioned earlier, we've got a suite of metrics, some that you need to hit hard limits for, some that you need to hit hard targets for, and others that are reporting only. And those reporting only metrics, it's not that they're any less significant in terms of net zero alignment, but it's that we didn't have sufficient data to be able to set robust limits or targets for them. So life cycle embodied carbon is the obvious one. We didn't have enough data to inform what a sort of science-led life cycle limit for each individual subsector would look like. But by asking for any building that's verifying in line with the standard to report against it, we're hoping that will really accelerate the amount of data that we have available. I hope that some of your listeners are familiar that we're asking for all projects that are verifying against the standard to report via the Built Environment Carbon Database, which we hope is going to become a one-stop shop for all of the embodied carbon information that we need to then create future life cycle limits, but also hopefully inform future embodied carbon policy. The other one for me that I think is really key is, I mentioned about buildings having an important role to play in supporting the grid to decarbonise. That's not just about reducing demand. We need to reduce demand by about 60% if there's going to be enough renewable energy to go around. But as we move from gas and coal generation, it's dispatchable, you can turn up and down in response to demand. We're moving from that to intermittent renewables like wind and solar, and the sun isn't always shining, the wind's not always blowing when people need electricity, and that's why buildings need to become increasingly flexible, so when renewable energy is available. So there are likely to be limits around demand side flexibility or peak demand in future that respond to that flexibility that the grid needs to see. And for that reason, we're asking for reporting on peak demand and time of peak demand as well.
That's really interesting. Oh, I look forward to seeing those. I look forward to seeing those developments when they come out.
In terms of other elements that we've said we're going to be looking at over the next 1 to 2 years, we understand that there are existing schemes out there that respond to a lot of the metrics that we've defined, and in some instances, schemes that are much more granular. So for specific metrics where there are other schemes that exist that may potentially maybe more robustly assess the building's performance, we'll be looking at sort of principles of equivalence to understand whether we can, rather than assess and report under the standard, you can use a scheme to demonstrate compliance with or conformity with a specific metric. So, I mean, the obvious one that we'll be exploring is neighbours for operational energy use intensity for certain sectors, but the principles of equivalence will be developed over the next few months, and then it will be up to other schemes to engage with us to understand whether there is the ability to kind of formally recognise them as being equivalent for certain metrics or certain elements of the standard.
Yeah, that's a great idea. There's definitely some sense of, I don't know what you call it, assessment fatigue or something, in the built environment, because there are so many different schemes. And this is what I was saying before a little bit. I was alluding to this idea that there are so many schemes which are trying to do kind of similar things, and there's loads of different schemes you could apply to assess your building in all different sorts of ways. So we talked about the fact that it's in pilot. It came out in September. You've mentioned that pilot period is 12 months. Can you give us maybe a quick potted timetable of what's going to happen over those 12 months? How do people get involved with it? How do projects get involved?
Yeah, absolutely. So we have a call for pilot projects at the moment. That's available on the website, and the deadline for applications will be the 31st of January next year. And the projects that are selected will be informed Q1 next year and get rolling straight after that. The only other sort of milestone that we've sort of publicly stated is that we're really hoping that we'll have the first version that you can sort of formally verify against by the end of 2025.
Yeah,
there's lots going on in that time. It's not just through the pilot, through becoming a pilot project that you can engage. Download the pilot version, review it, apply it on your projects, advocate for it, and I think most importantly, feedback. So it's not just the pilot projects that can feedback. There's an open call for feedback on the website. It's a survey, and any and all feedback and comments you might have on it, feed that back via the website, and we'll use that to inform the refinement that's going to be happening over the next year.
Brilliant. Well, that was a fantastic whistle-stop tour of the new net zero carbon building standards. Tom, thank you so much for coming on. It's been great to catch up again.
Thanks very much for having me. There we are.
No, that's right. It's been absolutely great. Hopefully we'll catch up again soon.
Thanks, Kev.